Today we're going to talk about the senseless fool. First of all, who is he? Secondly, what is his end? And finally, how do I avoid becoming him? The senseless fool is someone who is self-confident. They are someone who does not receive correction. This is a theme that runs over and over and over again throughout the book of Proverbs, and so you're going to hear it a lot this weekend. Now, last night we talked about Proverbs 14 and verse 26 that tells us in the fear of the Lord there is strong confidence. But when we're talking about a confidence that comes from fearing the Lord, it's not self-confidence, but rather it's a confidence in God. But the senseless fool is self-confident and he has no fear of God. In Proverbs 1 and verse 29, when it's speaking of a group of fools, it says they did not choose the fear of the Lord. Not only this, they don't only have no fear of God, but they also, of course, have no fear and no respect for his word. In Proverbs 13 and verse 13, we read, "He who despises the word will be destroyed, but he who fears the commandment will be rewarded." A fool, a senseless fool, is someone who does not fear the commandments of God. Also, he is someone who is self-righteous. In Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 15, we read, "The way of the fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise." There we see the contrast between the fool who thinks what he's doing is right. He's not going to take correction, but on the contrary, we have the one who is wise, who is not this fool, who takes correction. So as we think about this senseless fool who is unteachable and he is self-confident, we're seeing a picture of an individual who is very ugly, someone who we don't want to be, someone who we don't want to be around. But as we see over and over again through the book of Proverbs, as it describes certain things that are despicable to God, that God does not approve of, that God hates, the Proverbs paint those in a very realistic way. But the world paints the very same thing in a very different light. And that's the same with the senseless fool. Sometimes the senseless fool comes off very arrogantly. Sometimes he comes off in a way that nobody would appreciate being around. But sometimes the senseless fool is very smooth with his words. And he might sound very appealing. There is a phrase out there, especially in the religious world, the phrase is spiritual abuse. And I don't have time to go into this phrase in great detail, but first I just want to say it is possible for someone to abuse their authority, and there is absolutely no excuse for that. But what I want us to remember as we think about trying to avoid being the senseless fool, if someone comes to us and they correct us, and our first response is to accuse our corrector of spiritual abuse, we have put ourselves in this category. And it is a category that we want to fully avoid. Now, as we think about him being unteachable, the senseless fool hates knowledge. In Proverbs chapter 1, verse 22, it says, "How long, you simple ones, will you love simplicity? For scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge." This is a very clear indication of how this individual, the senseless fool, is unteachable. And one of the greatest hallmarks of the senseless fool is that he is unteachable. And so we're going to be noticing again and again the need to be teachable, the need to avoid being the senseless fool who is unteachable. Not only does he hate knowledge, he despises instruction. Proverbs 15 and verse 5, "The fool despises his father's instruction, but he who receives correction is prudent." There we see the concept of heeding our father's instruction. This is the audience that the book of Proverbs was written to was young people. And that's why it's a great theme for a young people's meeting, because it is a book that was written specifically to young people to encourage them to listen to their parents and to listen to wise instruction. Not only this, the simple fool despises wisdom. In Proverbs 1 and verse 7, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." He also despises rebuke. In Proverbs 1 and verse 30, it says of this group of fools we've alluded to a lot this week, in Proverbs chapter 1, "They would have none of my counsel, and they despised my every rebuke." Rebuke is not something that's always pleasant, but it's something we must appreciate, and it's something we must not despise. So as we think about the senseless fool, and we think about who he is, it's very important that we think about him in the full picture and what is his end. What is his end according to the book of Proverbs. First of all, the senseless fool will become desensitized. In Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 10, it says, "Rebuke is more effective for a wise man than 100 blows on a fool." Very vividly talking about the fact that for a wise person, you can correct them and they'll learn from it. A fool, you give him for the same offense 100 blows and he doesn't learn from it. Very clearly, the senseless fool is someone who is desensitized. He is calloused. He is not correctable. But not only is he desensitized, he will be disgraced. In Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 18, we read, "Poverty and shame will come to him who disdains correction, but he who regards rebuke will be honored." There we see the concept of poverty and shame. That's something that very clearly is a depiction of disgrace and dishonor that the fool gets when he does not heed correction. But not only will he be desensitized and be disgraced, finally the fool will be destroyed. In Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 7, we read that a fool's mouth is his destruction, and his lips are the snare of his soul. God gave us one mouth and two ears for a reason, but the fool, he overutilizes his mouth, and he does not utilize his ears. And we see that his mouth, because he overutilizes it, it leads him to his final end, which is destruction. In Proverbs 15 and verse 10, we are told, "Harsh discipline is for him who forsakes the way, and he who hates correction will die." We see finally his ultimate end is death. And there we see again the concept of being desensitized, where you have harsh discipline. Harsh discipline is something we all want to avoid. And if you're able to learn from smaller correction, you don't need harsh discipline. My younger brothers do a lot of horse training, and with horse training, if they'll listen when you give them a small cue to do something, they don't have to enforce it. But if that horse does not listen to the small correction, it gets more severe, and finally the horse will listen. And as you think about this fool, he is someone who never heeds just a small correction. And so he always has to get that enforcement, and eventually, because he doesn't even accept that, he results in destruction. So as we think about the senseless fool, who is an individual we don't want to be because of his end and his destruction that he's going to eventually get to, how do we make sure that we avoid being this senseless fool? First of all, I'd like to notice Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 15, which says, "Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child. The rod of correction will drive it far from him." As we think about learning to be correctable, this is something that starts very young. And so if you're here and you're very young, you're still in this stage where you're experiencing this verse, remember that your parents have the responsibility to help you learn to be correctable while there's hope, while you're still very young. This is a verse growing up. I wasn't always a very correctable kid. And so I got to experience this verse a lot. And I know I'm still not perfect in correctability, but it sure has helped me. It helped me a whole lot because as we think about our parents' responsibility to teach us to be correctable, they are preparing us to avoid destruction. And so when we're uncorrectable, if you're like me, you're going to hear this verse a lot, and you're probably going to feel it even more. And so we need to appreciate our parents for teaching us how to be correctable. So as we think about being correctable, and as we think about making sure that we can accept correction, the first step is that when we hear correction, we need to give an ear to it. We need to listen. In Proverbs chapter 5, verse 1, we read, "My son, pay attention to my wisdom and lend your ear to my understanding." Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 20, "Listen to counsel and receive instruction that you may be wise in your latter days." Proverbs 15 and verse 31, "The ear that hears the rebukes of life will abide among the wise." And that's just a small sampling of the Proverbs that talk about this fact. The Proverbs that talk about the need for us to listen to rebuke. Rebuke is something that is painful. It's something that we don't enjoy. And the primary reason that rebuke is painful is because it hurts our pride. And so as we are trying to develop a listening ear that is eager for correction, we need to get rid of pride. And that is a theme that you have heard multiple times. You're going to hear more about it again later tonight. The need to be humble. Because if we are humble, we will be eager to accept correction, because we're not worried about what people think about us, but rather we're worried about pleasing God, and we're worried about making sure that we are living a life that we ought to. And so when there's an opportunity to learn, we are eager for that opportunity. But not only should we listen, we need to learn. It's possible to listen to correction and turn around and completely ignore it. So we need to learn from correction. And the first thing we need to remember about learning from correction is that we have to recognize that we cannot trust ourselves. This is something that the fool does not recognize. In Proverbs 3 and verse 7, the Proverbs tell us, "Do not be wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord, and depart from evil." Proverbs 3 verse 5, a few verses before this, a proverb that we're very familiar with, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding." There we see we need to not trust in ourselves. We can't trust in ourselves, but we can trust in God, and we must trust in God. But we need to also receive correction, and we need to receive rebuke. In Proverbs 3 and verse 11, we read, "My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor detest his correction." In Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 5, we read that a fool despises his father's instruction, but he who receives correction is prudent. Someone who is eager to get correction there, we see, is someone who is prudent, the very opposite of being foolish. And that is the person that we want to make sure that we are. But not only should we receive correction and rebuke, we need to love it. And that's something that's not always easy to do, but it's something that we must develop in our character, is a love for correction. Because if we love correction, we're more likely to get it. And obviously, a lot of individuals don't want correction, and so they make it very clear when they're corrected that they didn't want it. But when we get corrected, we need to make it clear that we appreciate that correction. In Proverbs chapter 12, verse 1, this is a proverb that I like because it's extremely simple and also extremely frank when it says, "Whoever loves instruction loves knowledge, but he who hates correction is stupid." There we see the very opposite of being wise is the person who hates correction. And so we need to be, on the contrast to that, the first part of the verse, someone who loves instruction. In Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 23, "For the commandment is a lamp, and the law is light, and reproofs of instruction are the way of life." There is the reason that we should love instruction, because through instruction and correction, we can get life. We can have that way of life that is only achievable if we are willing to be correctable. But finally, we need to obey. We need to learn to listen, and then we need to learn, and we need to also obey. In Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 1, the proverb writer there says, "A wise son heeds his father's instruction, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke." There we see the concept of a wise son heeding or obeying his father's instruction. He not only listens to it, he not only learns from it, but he puts that learning into action. Proverbs 15 and verse 32, "He who disdains instruction despises his own soul, but he who heeds rebuke gets understanding." There again, we see the concept of obeying rebuke. Now, obviously, when we're reading the book of Proverbs, we're seeing a list and a conversation about rebuke and correction in the context of correction being accurate. Now, obviously, when we're corrected, sometimes that correction is going to be warranted, and sometimes that correction is not warranted. And so how do we react in situations where the correction is not warranted? First of all, we have to recognize that if we don't listen, and if we don't think about the correction, then we're never going to know whether the correction was warranted or not. So regardless of whether we think the correction is warranted or not, we need to listen to the correction. We need to learn from it. And then if the correction is warranted, if it is something that we need to obey, which when the correction comes from God, it is always warranted, and it is always something to obey, then we must obey it. And there is a whole lot more we could talk about on the senseless fool and on our responsibility to be correctable, but I want to just leave you with this verse from Proverbs 25 and verse 12, where we read, "Like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise rebuker on an obedient ear. There we see the perfect combination of someone who is a wise rebuker and someone who is an obedient ear. Our topic this time is about the recipient of that correction, but it's also important to remember as we talk about loving correction, there's obviously the giver and the receiver. And if we are the giver, we need to be a wise rebuker. What does it mean to be a wise rebuker? Well, it means that we know when and we know how to give a correction. But an obedient ear is someone who is willing to receive correction whether or not it comes in the right place or at the right time or in the right way. And so we need to be the type of people who is willing to accept correction regardless of how it comes. So as we think about the senseless fool, let us make sure that we don't take on any of his attributes. And on the contrast, and in the way to avoid that, we want to make sure that we are a people who is eager for correction.
We really appreciate you watching this channel and supporting the Chapel Grove Church of Christ YouTube page. I want to ask you a quick question. Do you want to help in a big way spread the gospel and help this channel succeed? All you have to do is click the subscribe button, click a thumbs up, and then share it with a friend. Share it on social media, share it on text. However you do it, just share it for other people to see. It helps the channel grow, it helps the videos get out there, and it helps spread the gospel in a really easy way that has a big effect. Thank you for supporting us, and come back for more videos.